You are listening to the Add Water and Stir podcast, where we have candid conversations about fostering, adopting, and parenting children of color. Our goal is to give voice and visibility to families like ours who are often left out of mainstream adoption conversations. Join in the conversation as we talk about the impact of race, class, and privilege on raising healthy, well-adjusted brown and Black children. This is the 57th episode of the Add Water and Stir podcast. I am adopted Black mom of the blog of the same name, and I am mother to now 17-year-old Hope. It's like amazeballs. I am joined today by my new guest host, Cristi. Hi, Cristi.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So tell us about yourself, Cristi.
Okay. So I have been a foster parent for the past couple of years. That is how I got to know Add Water and Stir. It was actually during my training where I was obsessively researching and trying to just make sure that I was doing all the things correctly, which obviously I did not. But I tried. I am married. I'm going to call my husband B for the sake of his privacy. And for 18 months, we fostered a little baby boy who came to our house as a very young infant. And so that was quite the experience. Thankfully, he has been reunified with his family. I'm going to call him William, even though that's not his name. I'm excited to sort of discuss with ABM and with the listeners, what does fostering towards reunification look like? What does the time after that look like? And then kind of explore as my husband and I look at doing a domestic adoption.
Cool. Awesome. So, and if you are really interested in hearing a bit more about Cristi's backstory, keep listening to this episode. We're going to be talking about children of the migrants. I'm really excited. Cristi reached out after Mimi finally left the show. I'm still in deep mourning, but I'm very, very, very excited. Cristi was one of the first people to kind of reach out and say, "Hey, I'm kind of down." So we've been doing some things pre-production, and I'm really excited to be working with you on a few episodes. And maybe you'll hang around. Who knows? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm honored to be working with you. I feel like when you have that dream as a kid where you step into your favorite TV show, like, oh my gosh, I'm in the podcast.
She's inside.
Yeah, I just busted through the iPhone,
It's all right. You'll find that the backstory is like really messy too. But just to kind of update folks on kind of what's been going on with me and Hope. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Hope just turned 17 recently. 17. This is her 4th birthday with me. We sat down earlier this week, Cristi, and we went through my pictures for the last 4 years. And,
oh, wow.
And it was just like, we went 1 year back, and then we went 2 years back, and we're looking at Christmas pictures, and we're looking at Easter pictures, and we're looking at spring break pictures, and then we're looking, next thing you know, we got to our finalization pictures, and we got to, when we were first matched, and I went to go see her, and just looking at things like how her face has changed. Like, she had a little bit of baby fat, and it's all gone now. She's like,
oh my gosh,
woman, and the stories behind the picture. It was just really sweet. And so, all of a sudden, she is a rising senior, and we're really make some moves. It's kind of crazy, and so
right. There's so much that comes with that transition. It's just that it's a big transition in life.
It is, but I have to say, from a parenting perspective, it's both exciting and kind of because and that's the only word I can kind of come up with, which isn't really a word. It's kind of like a feeling. So graduation and the looming graduation is such a big deal that everything in the senior year is a big deal, and you can't really miss anything. Longtime listeners and readers of my blog know I can't stand band season. But this is the last band season, so I got to be as many of those games as my schedule will allow. And I need to figure out when senior night is going to be, because I can't miss that. And then there's a senior night for this, and I can't miss that. And then there's a senior night for that, and I can't miss this. And it's just, kind of crazy, but which also reminds me, there's something in the living room. There's I need to reschedule her senior portrait, which, because that's another thing that has to be done. And
Right.
it's exciting, but it's just like, oh man, there's just a lot of crap that has to happen. So it's exciting. And the last big update is that readers of the blog know that she will be going to a summer boarding school program. So she leaves this weekend. And I realized this week how much I was really going to miss her. I mean, she's still going, but I'm going to
And you look through the pictures. So now that you've looked at her little chubby baby face.
Right. Like, you know, I'm really kind of in my feelings.
Take her to school. That's awful.
And now I'm going to probably cry. I'm hoping to hold it in, you know, and she's also been really, I don't want to say clingy, but very affectionate too. And so I know that we both have some feelings about her going. She's still going.
She's going.
She's going. The tuition is paid, so she's going. And I do plan on enjoying being child-free for a few weeks, but I also recognize that I'm gonna miss her. So anyway.
Yeah, and it's nice that I think the fact that it's short in the summer kind of gives you that, okay, I'm gonna enjoy it, but I also know that it's gonna come to an end soon and I'm gonna be able to see her soon. So I'm sure that feels a little better.
Yeah, it does. It helps. So so you are a former foster mom with the Hubs, getting ready to embark on a whole new journey of your own. How you feel about that?
Well, I mean, so at this point, we're several months out from our foster son being reunified with his family, and we're so lucky that we still get to see him on occasion. And of course, there's so many feelings with that. It's like we're dying to see him, and then we're just totally crushed after we see him because we just love him and miss him so much. And then sometimes I'm able to have that moment where I say, oh, look at all this time I have to myself. I need to try to enjoy this, even though I miss him dearly. So we've sort of been on this let's enjoy our time and stay distracted mission. So we went to Ireland with my family. We've been doing indoor rock climbing. Fell off the wagon a little bit there between our vacations. And we were able to go to Ecuador to visit my family and go to a wedding. So we've kind of just been filling up our days and really trying to enjoy the time together. But we still, we just go through those times where we miss our fosters so much. So the new adventure, I think it's very different had we not fostered first. So there's just sort of it's a quiet thing, I think, that we're feeling right now. We're not those potential adoptive parents who are like, we're adopting everybody, we can't wait, we're so excited. Because we feel the apprehension of everything it entails, and we know that for a child that will be adopted, there will be loss. There will be a huge loss for everybody involved. And so it's sort of this quiet apprehension. We, are obviously love the idea of adding a child to our family, but it's a quiet little road that we're taking together and just kind of taking all the pieces in. And I'm excited to go through it, I think, with you, because it's just so nice to be able to talk through, okay, how do we do this? Well, so it's an interesting time, but we're trying to kind of smell the roses as much as possible.
Do it. Smell the roses. Don't get me wrong. I love this season of my life. It hasn't always been easy, but I love this season of my life. But yeah, I'm looking forward to these 4 weeks of just. Did I mention that already? My bad. Summer camp for everyone.
That's good.
So, well, I'm really glad to welcome you to the show. So our listeners, feel free to drop a question in the comments on our blog at www.addwaterandstirpodcast.com, or you can always tweet us at AWAS Pod. That's AWASPOD for Add Water and Stir. So on today's show, we're going to talk about children of migrants. In May of this year here in the U.S., the Trump administration instituted a zero-tolerance policy that prosecuted anyone who crossed the U.S. border illegally, but anyone really being mostly from the southern border. The policy resulted in children being removed from the custody of their parents while those parents were referred for prosecution. Part of the rub is that many of these families were actually seeking asylum in the U.S. rather than, air quote, illegally crossing the border. They're being treated as illegal border crossers. Since the institution of this zero tolerance policy, about 2,500 children have been separated from their parents and placed in facilities that have been likened to detention centers, group homes. They've been shipped off to private agencies for foster care, like caretaking. Kids have really been dispersed all across the country. The politics around this has been really nasty. The optics have been really nasty. There's been a lot of blaming going back and forth. The media, the news media has just been pretty dramatic. In mid-June, Trump signed an EO, an executive order designed to prevent further separations, but the executive order didn't address those families that were already dispersed. So this week, the last week of June, a federal judge granted an injunction that prevented further separations and the direction to return all children to their parents within about a 21-day period, depending on the age of the child. One of the major issues cited in the ruling is that the fact that the kids' connection to their biological parents have not been documented well at all during this period of time. So it really remains to be seen whether all of these children will really be reunited with their families. This has been really a bit of a hot mess. It has been really especially triggering for the adoption community. I'd like to talk a little bit about these issues, talk a bit about this moment and some of the history that it beckons. We'll try to sidestep some of the major, larger political issues, but we do want to explore issues related to what's happening with these kids. And if you find yourself in a situation where you may be fostering and possibly down the road adopting one of these children, or, who knows, a child that may have been similarly separated from their biological family, what are some of the ethical ways that you can approach fostering and possibly adopting? I am delighted to welcome two guests to the show. I have a guest host helping me out today, Cristi. Say hi, Cristi.
Hi.
Cristi is an immigrant, and I want to give her, in just a moment, an opportunity to talk a bit about her personal experience. I think that will also frame some of our discussion. And I am also delighted to welcome long-term Adwater and Stir friend of the show, adoption attorney Michelle Hughes, to the discussion to kind of help us tease through some of the legal and ethical issues. Cristi, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, so just hearing about these children in this moment, I immediately put myself in their place. My family immigrated to the United States from South America when I was about 4 years old. And in our case, we really left under good circumstances. We had so much support. Our lives were not being threatened. We had our documentation. And still, I remember the feelings of apprehension. And it's really, as such a young child, what your body kind of encodes is not the specific memories, but the feelings that surround you in those moments. And so I remember sort of the feeling of apprehension, the sadness of leaving so many people that you love. And then when we got here, we had so many welcoming experiences along the way. We lived with relatives. It was a struggle for my parents, no doubt. My dad didn't have a job for 6 months. My mom was taking care of us. But at the end of the day, they had us to hold. And I think about that from their perspective. They were struggling and finding their place in this world. And every night they could see that they were doing it for us. They could hold us in their arms and really feel that they were making progress. And then for our part, my parents and my family were my world. And to some extent they still are. And we had the privilege of being able to stay together. So when you're in a strange new place and you don't speak the language and you don't know anybody, that is all that you have in the world, is the family that holds you close. And so I think because of so many of the welcoming experiences that we had, I think some people do sort of see us as model immigrants. Nobody really approaches me and tells me to go home. They know that I'm sort of a contributing member of society, but it really has to do with the welcome that we received. It has to do with the fact that we were allowed to stay intact, and that we had neighbors who, had us run through the sprinkler with their kids and that kind of embraced us. And so for these kids, it's really the opposite. When I put myself in their shoes, I think about the fact that they're being torn from that one piece of security and love that they have left in their lives, the rest of their world has really faded away. And so the only people that they trust in the world are suddenly gone. So I can't help but think, who could these children become if we weren't robbing them of that feeling of security and trust in the world, which they may have had, little of left after having to go through what they went through to even reach that southern border. But at this point, everything's changed for them, and everything that goes well from this point on will just be part of their healing from that moment where they no longer could believe that a loving parent would always keep them safe. That has been stolen from them. So in that sense, I'm so grateful for the way that I experienced immigration, and I just can't help but think of the futures that are being really robbed from these families. They're sort of in a state of arrested development, because I don't know what progress you can make as an immigrant in this country if you don't have wholeness in your family. If you have questions about where your child even is, is your child alive? Who is caring for your child? So that's what it brings up for me in my story, and I'm really excited to get some information from Michelle so that we can kind of tease apart what the issues are going to be for these kids being on their own.
It's an amazing story, the juxtaposition of what it's like to come and be treated well versus not is a strong one, and also that note, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, of what the body encodes during a traumatic event is really important as well. So Michelle.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. So what kind of hot mess is this? Like, what do we have going on here?
There's so many different angles that you could look at this from. I think from the adoption community, especially from international adoptees, this is a very triggering thing, because they, by definition, are removed from their biological parents when they are adopted to the United States. So this is reliving for many of them what occurred during the adoption process. Now, obviously, depending upon orphanage care and a variety of other things, it varies from child to child and country to country. But it's really triggering a lot of the adoption community about that separation, especially international adoptees, and the whole transition from going from one country where everybody looks like you to a country where people don't necessarily look like you, from a country that everybody speaks the same language that you speak to a country that nobody understands you. And so it's really triggering for a lot of adoptees. And as we process what is appropriate for these immigrant children who are being separated from their families, perhaps we should be looking at the larger picture for all adoptions too.
Yeah. One of the big questions that I've seen hanging out on the internet and Twitter and kind of engaging with a lot of adoptees who definitely say this is very triggering is what the legal status is. The legal status for so many of these kids is really unclear, because we do have a status for children who are unaccompanied and who cross the border, right? Unaccompanied minors. And there's a bureau for them, and there's a mechanism, a legal kind of framework for children with that designation. But these are not unaccompanied children. These were not unaccompanied children. They're still minors. And so it's really unclear where they even fit legally in this whole thing that we've kind of got going here.
Well, that's true. We really don't know. Given that these kids are not unaccompanied, and given that many of these parents were seeking asylum, and there are legal channels for that, and clearly the administration /ICE /Border Patrol are not following those mechanisms that are legally set up right now. So who knows what mechanisms they are legally or not following.
Right.
We really don't know is what it comes down to.
We don't know. And, and one of the other things that a lot of international adoptees have been talking about in the last couple of years is that there has to be, there's that certificate of citizenship. And not all of the international adoptive parents go all the way through that process, right? And so this has been really, I was chatting with someone just earlier this week who was like, I don't have that document, so I'm not really even sure. Like, I don't even feel like I can go out and protest.
Well, the truth of the matter is that it depends upon when you were adopted and what type of visa you came into the country. So the older adoptees, international adoptees, they didn't even have the option of a certificate of citizenship. That followed the law change in 2000. And there's an estimated 30,000 adult adoptees who are out of status and not citizens because their parents never did the naturalization process. After 2000, the law changed, and they said, well, if you're adopted internationally and you have a particular type of visa, once you hit the United States soil, you will be a citizen. But they didn't automatically send the certificate of citizenship. So again, parents had to process it. The other problem is that many adoptive parents assumed that every adoption automatically made your child a citizen, which was not true. It depended upon the type of visa that your kid was adopted under. And so you have different groups of international adoptees that fall into different categories. So, some need to be naturalized, some it's just paperwork to do a certificate of citizenship, some need to do a readoption if they're young enough, a readoption in the United States court, and then go get their certificate of citizenship. But without that proof of certificate of citizenship, they are at the mercy of the powers that be, and many of these kids come with trauma.
Right.
And one of the ways to get deported when you only have a green card is to have some type of drug crime. That's why the Citizenship Act of 2000 for adoptees actually came into being, because there was an adoptee. There was one that got adopted to returned to Thailand, and another one who got deported to Brazil. Mm-hmm. I think it was the one in Brazil at 17. He had some weed. He got busted. The defense lawyer didn't know anything about his adoption status, said, plead guilty. This is no big deal. You'll, get some community service, et cetera, et cetera. He did, but because he was on a green card and it was a drug crime, he got deported. He did not know anyone in Brazil. He did not speak the language. There were several of these cases that came about, and that's when the law changed. The problem was it didn't cover everybody from before. And that's thousands of people who have lived here for years. Many of them are not even aware that they are not citizens. Some of these adult adoptees are discovering they're not citizens when they go to get a passport, for example. I recently was reading about one woman who went to go get her passport, found out she wasn't a citizen, and she's been voting for decades.
Oh, my.
Here's the problem. Remember, there's that case right down in Texas right now where the woman's going to jail for 5 years for voting when she didn't have the right to vote?
Oh, gosh.
Oh, my goodness.
So they have no clue that they are not citizens. They just assume that they are, and their parents, in many cases, their parents probably did too. Plus, you have all these adoptees who are estranged from their parents.
Mm.
How do they get the documentation to actually even do what they need to do? Right?
Weird.
So there's all these layers and triggers. And there is, at the moment, the name escapes me, but there is a movement towards getting a particular law passed in Congress that would basically close the gap for all international adoptees. It's been floating around for a couple of years now. To date, it has not been passed.
So we'll get that information and make sure that we put it in the show notes about that legislation. After the EO was signed, I guess that was last week, but before the injunction went into effect this week, there were a couple of news stories saying, hey, like 500 kids have been reunited. And then after, this week kind of started, there was, like 6 kids have really been reunited. So we can't even get a good sense, a good count of how many kids have actually been out of this kind of roughly 2,500 children have been reunited with their families. So that's an issue. But do we even think that they're going to be able to reunite everyone?
I think they have the ability to do it. I don't think they have the will to do it. First of all, I don't think we have an accurate count on how many kids have been taken. I don't think they know exactly where all these kids are. They have not done any type, from what I'm reading, they have not done any type of matching, which in the age of 2018 seems pretty ridiculous. Chuck E. Cheese does matching when you think about it. When you go into a Chuck E. Cheese, they stamp you, right? They have the little black light, give you a number that matches your kid.
Yeah.
You know, we have DNA tests with swabbing. So there should be the ability to rematch these kids to these adults. But the problem is going to be, even if they have the will to do it, everybody they've deported, if they haven't swabbed those people, how are they going to get a swab from somebody who is in another country, may not have access or ability? And remember, a lot of these people are fleeing some serious violence.
Right.
So it's not like they can say, well, I'm going to go down to the courthouse today, you know, take off a couple hours from work and I can walk and take whatever bus and such and such. I mean, some of these people are hiding from their life.
Right.
Right. So where do they go to get a swab, to get matched with their kid and be reconnected? And that's assuming they live.
Right. Right.
Right. And we know that there have been several immigrants that have been deported to their countries and subsequently were killed in the same manner that they warned that they would be, you know, when seeking asylum. So there is that fear these parents may not be there to be reunited with.
So they have to be able to have the access, and you're right, they have to actually be alive to do it. And those types of things we don't have control, and we're not doing it now. Right. You know, we could do it before we put people on a plane. Yeah. We could do it when we actually separate those two people at the border. Right. Not that I'm suggesting we should separate people, but there are some pretty easy logistical things that we could be doing now. And I think we are selecting, we meaning our government, we are selecting to not do this. I mean, there's no reason to separate them that day either. Why not take a day or two? I mean, so you can get the documentation.
Seriously, Ancestry, I think, is on like Groupon this week for like $40. Like, it's a spit test. Like, and you can find family. So there's no reason why we can't have swabs, you know, that there be some DNA collected.
I think one of them actually volunteered to do it for free. So, I mean, it shouldn't even cost the government any money.
Yeah. Well,
right. Although they're spending goo gobs of money to do this, but you know, they're
like, we could go down the total rabbit hole of talking about the money making, you know, under the table kind of black market kind of industry that's happening and growing up all around this. I mean, we've also know that the prison complex, industrial complex is also trying to figure out how to make some money on this. With detention
well,
centers.
And it's triggering adoptees too, because some adoptees really feel that these kids will disappear into adoption and or foster care system, which will make some money. I actually understand their fears. I do not know if people will be really making money the way they think that people will make money.
Sure.
But that's there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts.
Yeah, so let's go down the rabbit hole that's like next door to that one. So we know that there are probably a population of these children who will likely, for any number of reasons, end up in foster care or foster care kind of like situations, probably longer range, with some of them possibly being adopted. And we also know that there are families that would be happy to provide those homes, right? So what are some things for folks to keep in mind for any foster and adoptive situation, but particularly in situations like this? What are some of the ethical considerations that families who, you know, maybe also so desperate for a placement of a child may make some tricky, icky decisions? So what kinds of things should they be thinking about?
Well, I think different people draw different ethical lines when it comes to foster care, adoption, and these particular situations which may lead to either foster care or adoption. And I also think there's a difference when you're offering temporary foster care with the full intention of reunification. I mean, these kids have to go someplace. Right? If the government is not going to come to their senses and keep them together with their parents, I mean, you can't leave the kids on the street by themselves to fend for themselves. So they're either going to have to be institutionalized somewhere or they're going to have to go to foster care. I don't think that we should necessarily chastise the foster parents who are giving this temporary care until reunification happens. The problem is that what if reunification doesn't happen? And with all foster care, the intent is reunification with the biological parents, providing they can provide the care for the child, right? And I think that people who are choosing who should be fostering these children should be screening out people who are looking to adopt. These kids should be seen as temporary placements until they can be reunified, and not potential adoptive kids.
Okay. I'm going to foster, and that's it. That's the plan.
That's the plan, because the kid has to go somewhere. I mean, ultimately, I would, the preference would be that the government changes its policy, but I also live in reality. And if the government doesn't change its policy, somebody has to feed the kid, clothe the kid, care for the kid, get the kid to school, kiss the kid's boo-boos. I mean, somebody's got to do it.
Right.
And you want a responsible, loving foster parent to be doing that until they can be reunited. But some people go into foster care thinking, I'm doing this temporarily, and then I'm going to send the kid back to where the kid is supposed to be. And some people go into it thinking, this is my opportunity to get my hands on a child, right? And with this political situation, we know that this has ethical concerns about parents losing their children for the wrong reason. We've seen people who argue anybody who comes to our border with their child must by default be somehow neglectful or irresponsible with their child.
Right.
And I think that we have to make the argument, people do make the argument, which side are you on? Do you see the fact that they're bringing their child to the United States for asylum as neglectful or not? If you think it's neglectful, these children are in the exact same position as any foster child.
Right.
If you see this as these people are making the correct decisions for their children, and especially when you consider they're fleeing violence and everything else, they're trying to keep their child alive. That does not make them neglectful. And they shouldn't lose their child. And to take someone else's child when they are not neglectful and have not voluntarily signed their rights away is unethical.
Yeah.
And I think one of the fears I have having fostered is that the information that you receive as a foster parent is sometimes nothing. So I think the majority of people who brought their children to the border have had really the courage and the resources to get their children away from danger. And so obviously to call that neglectful, I think is ridiculous, even though clearly people make that argument. But I do think that foster parents will receive these kids into their homes, and I don't know that they will feel clear on, did this child's parents commit an actual crime, not simply just crossing the border, but in general, what information are they going to receive about these families? I think there's a good shot, at least from my experience, that the information will be, this child's parents are not available. We can't tell you why. We don't know why. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they abandoned their child at a certain point in this process, or if they simply are detained against their will and are desperately fighting back for their child. So I don't think we can assume either that foster parents will know who's who.
One could argue, though, that Sorry, Christy. One could argue that the foster parent should have a responsibility, or that the agencies that are helping them should have a responsibility to try and find these children's parents and get the answers. I mean, if we have adult adoptees who had totally closed adoptions from 70 years ago, finding their birth parents through DNA, we certainly can make that effort through the system now and find out if these parents are willing and able to take their kids back.
Yeah, and every foster parent should be going into that foster care situation looking towards how can I support reunification. I'm not saying that it's not a fact, but I know that because, like you said, there are people who will argue that bringing your child to the border is neglect, that some of those same people may be vetted and become foster parents and think themselves, quite the savior for bringing a child into their home and away from these parents. So I think it might not so much be, adoption versus fostering, but the idea that certain parents are just unfit by nature. And I think that kind of goes into the race issue and cultural issues about what is good parenting and what is the effect of poverty and living in a country with rampant violence on your ability to be seen as a fit parent.
Right.
I think that actually is arguments that could be made right here in the United States, actually. Yeah. I agree with you. I think when you get to classism and race, and you look at our own foster care system and which kids are much more likely to be separated from their parents and not reunified, you have the same issues going on, and that perhaps we need a shift both with domestic and international kids who are taken into care.
In the event that you get a placement, you don't know what's the long game. So that child may end up being with you for a really, really long time. Again, legal status, who knows what that is right now. And it probably will take a long time to sort out, if ever. If you're parenting or hope to parent a child that has come to you through this path, how should you talk to this period about how this child came to live with you, how you came to parent this child?
I was talking to a client earlier today, and I said my basic rule with any of this stuff, if you can't explain it to your child, you shouldn't be doing it. And so if any parent moves towards taking this child or any child under these circumstances, they're going to have to be able to explain it to their child. And I think people have to understand that we live in 2018. All of this is on the internet. And so even if you may think, well, that the biological parents were neglectful from running from their worn-torn, violent domestic abuse, whatever, to try and get asylum, and that the child should be removed, someday that kid is old enough to Google. And they may disagree.
Yeah.
And so I think that people need to realistically be educated, that people have a different perspective on this, and that there will be conflict, most likely, between the foster parent / possible adoptive parent in the United States and this child. And, countries change. People live. I think a lot of these kids will ultimately be reunited. If we look at the international adoption scene from countries all over the world, even countries like China, where they said, these kids are abandoned and they'll never be reconnecting with birth parents. Guess what? Some of them are. Yeah. Right? And so the assumption that these reconnections won't happen and that they won't ever desire to go find their biological parents, and that their biological parents won't be excited to see them and to reconnect, and that their biological parents won't tell them their version of the story, and that they won't be mad, is a pretty big leap for these adoptive parents. And so therefore, if you have to consider all those things, it looks pretty unethical to adopt one of these children. Because it's pretty hard to explain. And if remember, the purpose of adoption is when a kid is available, either because the biological parents voluntarily make the decision or because the state if they have correctly decided, which is not always the case, but if they have correctly decided the biological parents cannot parent appropriately, is that the adoptive family have a positive parent-child relationship.
Right.
If you are unethically adopting in a situation like this, or any situation, you are always undermining your positive parent-child relationship.
I would also add that, and just not just in terms of being able to explain it, but really being aware and cognizant and open to the fact that adoption, or even that long-term foster care placement, quite likely in this day and age can open and will open, right? That connection will be made some kind of way. I mean, then it was like almost 6 months to the day when my daughter's family found us on Facebook, from 6 months to the day from her placement to when they reached out. And so they had been looking for her. She had been in the system, and we were able to make that connection. The reality is that these kids, I just have to believe a lot of them will be found. I think that Michelle's right. I think you're right that a lot of them will be reunited. But for those who aren't, I think that there will be a reconnection.
Well, and I think a lot of them will not be reunited, actually, but will reconnect.
Right, reconnect.
So they especially with these babies, if we as a government or a country don't decide to proactively make this reunion, the reunion will happen. It will just happen when the child is old enough to go do a DNA swab, or when the child is old enough to get on Facebook or Google. And, I would imagine that if it hasn't already been set up, there's probably some group right now already on Facebook or portal that connects parents and kids when they have access to electronics. It's like the sperm donors.
Right.
You know how the sperm donor siblings have a donor registry connection? Well, it's going to be the same thing that can be tapped into from anywhere in the world, so any country. And so just because the government delays it and puts these kids in foster care and maybe they get adopted does not mean there will not be a reconnection. But at that point, you have a mess of who is the parent that you shouldn't have in the first place.
Right. At that point, you've lost so much. I mean, that I think you can't get back. And I think as the adoptive parent, whether you had good intentions or not, I think that you're facing that child with how you treated their family, whether you saw them as their family or not. That's their family. And that's something that as a foster parent was always in my mind. How did I treat your mother? Whether or not I call myself your mother, how did I treat your mother, who you will absolutely be reconnected with no matter what?
And the other thing is that eventually when these kids reconnect, and they start Googling, they're going to have their own opinions on all of this.
On all of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're going to have opinions on our government. We also have to remember that there's going to be the exceptions, which are probably more likely to be the exceptions to the rule, because there are going to be some of these parents who are like, look, at least I got my kid to safety.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The assumption is that by the government is that if we do this, then nobody will want to come to the United States or try and get in anymore. But if the choice is for you to remain in some country and you and your child to be dead, or try and get into the United States, and worst case scenario, you and your child live, but separated, what choice do you think most parents are going to make? They're still coming to the United States.
Well,
I don't even think this policy is effective.
Well, I don't either. And I think that the philosophy that underpins it is flawed. There's very little that I wouldn't do for my daughter. Like, but
you would rather have your child alive than your child dead. And when you read some of these cases of people running for asylum, they don't really have a choice, because if they stay where they are, their child is dead.
Right.
So even if they get deported back, at least they know that sooner or later they will probably reconnect with their child and their child will be alive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's for so many families, that is a motivation for so many parents. And so, you know, it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that there are folks advocating for this policy who don't get that. Of course, like, if I'm in this situation and I want my child to be safe, I'm going to try to move heaven and earth to make that happen. Like, it's like, it doesn't make sense to me that type of rationale doesn't make sense to them. But that's
right. This idea of, I wouldn't commit a crime, period, but to save your child's life, you would, you know? It's a quote unquote crime, but
right.
The argument that somebody would not put themselves in this position is simply the ignorance of never having been in that position, and I hope they never are.
Right.
But I totally agree.
I think a lot of people really don't understand how much of the world lives.
Yeah.
You know, they don't I think a lot of people just don't understand how much violence, how much poverty, how much domestic violence occurs in the world, and frankly occurs in our own country too.
Yeah.
As an adoption attorney, my job is to do the legal work.
Right.
But I find myself often explaining to people about things in our country that people don't really realize how common domestic violence is. People don't really realize that people are not eating in our country.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have this whole group of Americans, whether we're talking about the children that are coming across the border or talking about adopting here domestically, that don't understand that people do not live their perfect little middle class life.
Right. Right.
And when you are not living that same life, you make different decisions. Poverty makes you make different decisions. Violence makes you make different decisions. Getting someone who's about to, try and kill you, whether it is your boyfriend or whether it's some gang or whatever, or is going to rape you or put you into the sex trade or put your kid into the sex trade, makes you make different decisions.
Right.
And so I think a lot of these people make these policy decisions from this middle class perspective. I should say, I think a lot of these adoptive foster parents make it from a middle class perspective, and a lot of these policy decisions are being made by, quite frankly, people who are very wealthy and don't have a clue on what motivates people who are running for their lives.
Right.
And so when you put all that together, there's a disconnect.
I mean, what we're watching and the policies that we're watching are really privilege in action is really kind of what it boils down to. And this is just how far removed sometimes policymakers can be from a lot of people's reality, and what it looks like on the ground and what it looks like at home, in your neighborhood, in your community, can look very, very different, and how those policies play out. So, well, we are hopeful that these kids get reunited, not just reconnected, but reunited. We'll probably revisit this topic, because I have a feeling this won't be the first. I think this will only be the first time. I think that there's supposed to be certainly some action on immigration reform, but my background is in politics. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of right before a midterm. It's kind of risky for a lot of politicians to take certain types of votes. So we'll see what happens.
We need to do policy that respects families and considers everybody's humanity for all of this.
Yeah. So I think that's the note that we're going to wrap up on. Be mindful of, in any foster and adoptive care situation, be mindful of not only your child's humanity, but their family's humanity as well, their family of origin.
Right. And be mindful that people will reconnect.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much inevitable. Well, there you have it, folks. I don't know if we untangled a whole bunch of mess or created a whole bunch more, but there's a lot of food for thought here. So we'll keep monitoring what's happening just like everyone else. So, Michelle, thank you.
My pleasure. I think we created more mess, but my pleasure. I actually prefer to think about the deeper questions, and I don't know, and I don't think people will always agree, frankly.
No.
But if we don't have the discussions, if we don't communicate about this stuff, and we just use the talking points that other people are using, it's not going to help anyone.
So, Michelle, where can folks find you?
Probably the best place to find me is at my law office.
Right.
312-857-7287. And why I primarily practice in adoption, assisted reproductive technology, and real estate. If I don't do it, I usually know a lawyer that does.
Right.
Or I can use my networking skills.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It is my pleasure. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. So we have one recommendation as we wrap the show. Please like our Facebook page. Tell a friend to like our Facebook page. Tell your mama. Tell your cousin to like our Facebook page. Everybody like the Facebook page. Post your questions. Talk to us. Post your own favorite adoption quotes, your memes. Tell us about what parenting is like for you. We love hearing from you. So, get at us. Cristi, where can they find you on the internet, or do you want to be found?
Well, do not find me. They can find me on Twitter at Whales for Days, whales as in the large sea mammal. And that handle actually came about because when we were fostering, we found ourselves strangely addicted to baby things that had whales on them. So our foster son was just living in a world of whales. It was the blankets, it was the onesies. And so we were just this is the whale, era of our life with him. And so I like to keep it as a sweet reminder of him. And so, they can find me at Whales for Days.
Whales for Days on the Twitters. You can always find me on Facebook, the blog adoptive.blackmom.com, and on Twitter as well at adoptiveblackmom. Thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of the Add Water and Stir podcast. You can find all of the show notes at addwaterandstirpodcast.com. Subscribe and leave us 5-star ratings, please, through iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. That'll help people find us. And we absolutely love engaging with our audience. So you can also find us on, of course, Facebook, as we mentioned before. You can also email us at feedback@awaspod.com. That's feedback@awaspod.com. Or, of course, tweet us at addwaterandstirpod. So, on that, we will say goodbye until the next episode. We've got some cool stuff in the hopper for you. Thanks so much, Cristi.
Thank you, ABM.
Bye, everybody.